Good morning, everybody. Gail, can you shut that door? I got it.
Morning.
Is Pastor teaching the kids?
Yep. Teaching is a strong word.
All right. Let's open up in prayer this morning. Father God, thank you for today. I ask that you would help us to put aside those concerns and worries of the world, Lord, and help us to focus on you. Give us an attitude of worship and praise. Ask that you would bless our meeting today and be with the Spokane Church, that your presence would be felt among all of them, and I ask that you would be with the messages today. Anything that is false would be forgotten and corrected. Thank you for all of your blessings and trials and everything that you provide us with. Amen.
We're done now, Justin.
I was going to see how long you do that. All right. See if I can do a recap off the cuff here. So, Rome is ruled by a tetrarch now. So Diocletian is kind of the head guru. And we left off where he he took the advice of Galerius here to start persecuting the Christians. It was not received well among Rome, and so the popular opinion of Diocletian was degrading, and he, on his anniversary, he decides to enter in Rome for the first time in something like 20 years, since he had basically moved the capital to Turkey, to Nicomedia. He enters Rome and is essentially shunned by the citizens of Rome, and so he ends up leaving early, returning back on his way to Turkey, and he decides he's had enough, so he retires, and he convinces Maximian to retire with him, to kind of give way for the Genzers to come in and, take their stead. So him and Maximian retire, which basically let Galerius be the head guru. So Galerius takes position as head Augustus and is essentially overseeing the Eastern Empire, and Constantius is overseeing the Western Empire. So Galerius elects to, upon the kind of the advice of Diocletian, he wanted to try and keep the tetrarch functional, so he, guided him to, steer away from electing through their bloodline. So he chose basically the random generals that were in the military, except for Maximinus Daia, who was, I think, his nephew, and as we'll get into here in the future, Maximinus Daia will continue the policy of Christian persecution. So he kind of, absorbed his the ideology of his uncle, and then Valerius Severus. So both Constantine, who was basically taken under early on in his career, he was taken under Diocletian's wing, set up as a general, and was basically positioned in Gaul most of his career. And so Constantine established a really good relationship with the Germans, as that will become pertinent here today. But Diocletian and Maximian's son, Maxentius, are basically passed over for the position of, co-Augustus. So they're pretty ticked, especially Maxentius. He kind of has his father's fiery spirit. Constantine's more of a strategical thinker and more passive at this point. And so Maxentius decides that he wants to be recognized as Augustus, so he essentially, with the backing of the Senate, takes control of Rome, the city. And so Severus, upon being named by Galerius, is sent to Rome to basically remove Maxentius. So Severus marches on Rome. He gets dealt with pretty handily and is killed. And so then Galerius takes on the role to march on Rome, and he is also defeated by Maxentius and his Praetorian Guard. So Galerius retreats back to the east, and upon the death of Severus, Galerius sets up, that's Constantine, Licinius. So he sets up Licinius as Augustus in the east as well.
Oh, he looks like a cartoon.
Kind of looks like a grasshopper.
These busts do not do any justice to them.
Yeah. And I feel sorry for Constantine's sister, because in the future, in
That's
order
her
to
man.
establish a political relationship, he gives Licinius his sister and as wife. So
Okay, I have a question. So kids and I are learning Latin, and I'm seeing a lot of Latin, obviously, all their names. This is very Latin, like, historically, language based. And so seeing all these names, I have a question about the names because sometimes, like popes, right? They adopt a name when they take rule. Was that similar to this?
Yep.
They would take a name.
that's why a lot of these
Okay.
have the same first name, because they're adopted as sons.
I knew what Valerius means, but Licinius means snub-nosed
Snub-nosed.
or upturned. Did you choose that for yourself?
Maybe his mom did. Was like,
Yeah.
this boy is
Well, like on the
Lycidius.
previous one, if you flip back real quick. Sorry, one more.
Flavius means yellow hairs.
Severus means stripped, right?
Severe.
And Valerius is
Victorious.
yes, victory,
With
strong.
valor.
Maximus, of course, great, the greatest.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, as you're telling these stories, I'm kind of trying to like pick out their names and like biblical too, right? God would name a person based on their kind of role of history, and so I'm curious if they're like trying to like live up.
Daza is not standing out to me though.
It wasn't to me
It's
either.
Dia.
It's what?
Dia. It's pronounced Dia.
The Z.
D-A-Z-A though?
Yeah, it's
But then-
pronounced Dia.
The ending is not quite a Latin type.
And it's spelled differently, depending on who you're reading. So I think it also spelled D-A-I-A, or
Dia.
something like that.
Okay, like a king. But Maximinus? The big and the small?
No, it's just
Maximinus?
Maxim.
Minus? So
I
Maxi
think
means big.
Maxim is the root, great. Us is the Latin ending.
But the nus, the N would change that.
Maximin. I don't know. Sorry to divert. I was just, as you keep explaining all the different qualities
Yeah.
and then watching their names, there's a lot
Let me just.
that are similar, right? Maximinus is kind of a similar one throughout. Valerius that's on the next slide. So I'm kind of putting their names together.
So when Severus marched on Rome, Maximinius is, basically on the sideline retired, but he wants, he's a man without a purpose. Constantine satisfied with, growing his cabbages on his farm. And so Maxentius, reaches out to his father for military support to go up against Severus, as Severus is marching towards Rome. And so Maximinius is glad to re-enter in the equation, and so he helps defeat Severus, and after defeating both Severus and Galerius, Maximinian's like, well, man, I miss this, so he basically pronounces himself as Augustus over Rome and tells his son to basically take the sideline, and his son basically tells his father to shovel sand. I'm not turning over my authority to you. And so his father rips his cloak off of him in front of all his soldiers, and his soldiers did not take kindly to that. So Maximian basically is forced back to the sideline, and he actually retreats back to Galerius, even though he just helped defeat or push Galerius back to the east. And given their past relationship, Galerius didn't execute him. He basically him and Maximian, the tetrarch is basically falling apart. So they're like, well, we gotta fix this. So they go back to Diocletian, and hold a meeting, and like, how do we get this back to the point where it was when you were leading this? And so that's when Diocletian basically told him to, because Constantine at the time was established after his father's death. After Constantius's death, he was established by his soldiers as Augustus over the Western Empire. And so, backing up, sorry, I forgot, Galerius actually, upon Constantine, or when Diocletian retired, Galerius took Constantine, brought him to the east as basically a hostage, because he was afraid that, you know, Constantine was gaining popularity. So he held Constantine in the east to kind of work under him, and Constantine kept pleading, you know, let me return to my father, and he kept denying him. And then one day Galerius got plastered, and Constantine finally convinced him to let him go. So that night he packed up and ran over to his father before Galerius sobered up and changed his mind. So Constantine's back with his father dies, Constantine's established really as Augustus over the West, Britain, Germany, France, and so Maximian is goes to Galerius. They approach Diocletian to try to fix the tetrarch. Diocletian gives them advice to basically ignore Constantine's position as Augustus, and as well as Maxentius. And so they announce this coming out of their meeting. Obviously Maxentius does not take kindly to this, and Constantine's like, well, you guys can say what you want. I have all my support in the West. There's not much you can do about it, so I'll remain Augustus without your support. So Constantine basically, labels himself as Augustus and keeps that position. All right. So really, over a period of 2 years, the tetrarch basically fell apart. So there's this boiling civil war between the East and the West. And so, Galerius is fighting against Maxentius, who's in Rome, who's got the support of the Senate, and he's essentially Augustus of Rome, even though not recognized by Galerius and Maximus Daia. And so Galerius continues, trying to march on Rome, and so Maxentius reaches out to Constantine, to get his backing, his military support, and Constantine, strategically says, I'll neither support you or Galerius. I'll remain neutral. So he basically remains neutral, but which was an advantage to Maxentius, because Maxentius was worried that Constantine would go over to Galerius and support him. So as a show of good faith, Galerius gives Constantine his sister in marriage.
So this is a different dude.
Sorry, that's Lucinus. So he's labeled Augustus of the East along with Galerius after the meeting between Diocletian and Galerius and Maximian. They decide on on the replacement for Severus, who had been killed by Maximian and his father. They name Licinius as his replacement. So Constantine.
Is that a mustache? Or just his weird upper lip?
I don't know.
It has to be.
I think it's a
Yeah, I think it's mustache. Either that or you have bad acne on his upper lip. So Constantine had really, actually let me back up.
And Constantine, he was on the previous side. He's the one that looks like the Hades.
Like the really intricate, yeah, like
Right here.
Oh, that one. 'Cause
Yeah.
there's another Constantine.
He's
Before.
basically
aren't they?
almost worshipped in the West, like,
That's the Constantine that people think about when we hear Constantine.
Okay.
that's Constantine.
Because on
Constantine the Great.
one more back, there was the Hades looking guy. Again, sorry. That guy.
That's his father,
Constantine.
that's his father,
Okay.
Constantius.
That's the one that did the Cabbage Patch.
No, that is Diocletian.
Yeah.
So he's basically the one that started the Tetrarch
Oh.
and brought Rome back to a kind of a unified Rome after its breakup. Okay,
Alright.
Look at the lions on his
so
legs.
also, if you remember Constantine, so Maximian is, you know, basically after coming out of the meeting with Diocletian and Galerius, Maximian is told by Diocletian that he needed to retire again. So Maximian, you know, given his loyalty to Diocletian, you know, grumbly agrees, but Constantine understands, you know, his personality and his desire to, you know, be at the forefront, be important. So Constantine basically takes Maximian as one of his primary generals to lead his military. And so, you know, Maximian over time, you know, misses his position, so he decides to spread the word that Constantine's been killed. And obviously no one, by this time, all the soldiers think that Maximian's kind of, you know, past his prime, had his heyday, and is kind of delusional, so no one believes him. And, you know, Constantine is pissed at him, so he brings Maximian before him and says, you know, why don't you do us all a favor and basically off yourself. So Maximian commits suicide.
Oh, he does it?
Yeah,
Wow.
Sucks.
He'd be too proud to.
what's that?
I would think he'd be too
Yeah.
proud to. Like that would be
Do we know
beneath
the whole story there? Or, I mean,
Yeah, so that's
Constantine-
basically what Constantine said. He said, you know, I can't remember the direct quote, but it was around that attitude. He's like, you know, why don't you do what's good for Rome and do, you know, the thing. Like he didn't say commit suicide, but it was implied.
well, I mean, you know, we don't know what the room looked like. You know, maybe there's a whole bunch of Constantine soldiers there that were like, you know, you better off yourself, or
Yeah,
you know,
true.
I'm gonna take you out with my sword. Your blood's
True.
gonna be all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, you know, after he basically humiliated his son in front of his soldiers, and now he's trying to, you know, kind of coerce, you know, the soldiers away from Constantine, and basically Constantine's almost worshipped in the West, so, yeah, possible. So in 311, Galerius got really sick and died. Eusebius, who's a Christian writer at the time, wrote that Galerius was so sick that no matter how many baths Galerius took, the stench of his insides filled the palace. So the thought is that he got some kind of gangrene. So sensing the end was near, he realized that his persecution of the Christians was a failed attempt, as they remained resilient as ever, and so he abandoned the policy. But, you know, as I mentioned earlier, his nephew Maximinus Daia would later adopt the policy and basically, you know, restart the persecution of Christians. So shortly thereafter, in December of 311, Diocletian also died. In his last few months, he found himself unable to ensure the safety of his wife and daughter as they were taken hostage by Maximinus Daia, following the death of Galerius, because he wanted to marry the daughter, wife of Galerius, daughter of Diocletian. So he eventually committed suicide, Diocletian did, And so he was 66 and ruled for 20 years.
Who was that?
Diocletian.
Died of, he died of suicide as well?
Yeah,
Cabbage guy?
yeah, the cabbage guy. Historians believe he just basically, he's sitting there watching the empire that he basically built from scratch from, Civil War fall apart again, and was just tired, and so he just, suicide was pretty common within Rome.
Must be stressful being in fire.
So Constantine will basically shut the door on the age of Diocletian. So throughout Diocletian's reign and during the falling apart of the Tetrarch, he remained distant, playing it safe and being strategic. Since succeeding his father in 306, he was successful in securing and establishing a power base in Britain, Gaul, and Spain, as well as evading any open confrontation with the other emperors, remaining neutral during their conflicts. So now that Galerian, Diocletian, and Maximian are gone, this is all about to change as he becomes convinced that God made him invincible. During his younger years, he was obviously exposed to the Roman hierarchy of gods, as well as the pagan gods that existed within Gaul, and he had no issues with the worship of these gods. He counted Mars and Apollo in his younger years as his patron deities. But as he grew older while under his father, he seemed to have drifted into monotheism while still respecting the old pantheon, but was moving towards Aurelian's Sol Invictus. You all remember what the Sol Invictus was, right? So,
Worship of the sun god.
yeah. So Aurelian basically established a policy that was new in Rome of monotheism, in that they would worship one god, the sun god, and they called it Sol Invictus, which was December 25th. So when he became Augustus in 306, his court would actively spread the propaganda of solar monotheism. His religious evolution was primarily due to his superstitious efforts to identify the correct God. So he would, using dreams, divine omens, and protective symbols, he would basically seek out and worship the one true God. And also, it was Constantine's goal to seek out the surest path to absolute power that also drove his religious evolution. So there's an age-old question on whether or not Constantine was actually a believing member of the Christian movement, or if he was just exploiting it to achieve his path to power. Many historians believe both are true, but in a self-motivated, self-serving sense. So he sought after power, but he fully believed that the only way to do this was to be on the right side of the only true and most powerful God. So he, I think, and this is just opinion, we obviously don't know, but the common question is, was he politically motivated, or did he actually believe what he was spitting out? And I think, I haven't read a lot about Constantine, but there's some historians that I agree with that it was, based on his actions, it was both, that he truly did believe in the Christian God, but it was more of a self-serving belief. He wanted true power, and he felt like the only way to do that was to follow God. So God served his purposes, Constantine's purposes, from his viewpoint. So upon Diocletian and Galerius' death, there was a cohort of people who were unhappy with the existing order, and Constantine figured that in order to be successful, that he would need to gather together these people, gain their support, and get them working for him. one of these fastest growing cohorts were the Christians. So the Christians were coming off this great persecution, and so here's this, man that's offering and actually, starting to follow their God. So Constantine was loud about his sympathy for the Christians and would tell anybody listening that he was only doing what God was bidding. Constantine shared that he would experience visions and dreams that promised him victory as long as he gave himself over solely to the Christian God. Of course, he only shared this after he became the sole ruler of the empire, providing a nice origin story. So when asked about Constantine, most people will tell you about a man who saw the sign of a cross in the sky the day before a great battle and was told by Christ to conquer using this sign. Then he painted the sign on the shields of all his men and then proceeded to overwhelmingly defeat his oppressor in this great battle. And then he would establish Christianity as Rome's official religion. In actuality, Christianity wouldn't become Rome's official religion until the reign of Theodosius 50 years later. So we'll get into that later. So these common stories come from two main sources. You have Lactantius, who's a contemporary Christian writer that wrote around the time of 320, 325 AD. And he wrote about Constantine having a vision the night before the battle of the Milvian Bridge against Maxentius, and told Constantine, that Constantine received a sign of the letter X with a line through it turned at the top, marked on all shields. This was the Greek letter Chi and Rho, the first two letters of Christ's name. So this was supposedly the first time this was used as a Christian symbol, but thereon after, it would become the exclusive symbol of Christianity. So prior to this, it was used by scholars as a sort of bookmark, marking a passage they would want to return to because the letter Chi and Rho were the first two letters of the Greek word for good, which I don't fully understand because the first two letters are Chi and Lambda, so kalos, but that's what the historians say. So Eusebius of Caesarea is another Christian writer during Constantine's time. He wrote the history of the early church. So he's the other primary written source on Constantine's account. And he says the night before the battle, Constantine saw a sign of a crossed light above the sun with the Greek words, "Upon this sign conquer." And this his whole army saw the same vision. And then Constantine was visited by Christ himself, who told Constantine to use the Chi Rho as a symbol of power against his enemies.
It's convenient.
Yeah. So this prompted Constantine to create the Labarum, which is this guy here. So the Labarum was a standard that his military would march with that had the Chi Rho symbol above the cross. So there was a cross underneath the cloth here.
What do the three dots symbolize?
I don't know. I'll look into that. So most historians chalk this up to useful fiction on Constantine's part. But what is fairly apparent is that given the fact that Constantine offered no dedication to God, at least publicly until after he had become sole ruler, may mean that he left himself open for fluctuation and maneuvering politically as events unfolded to accommodate multiple popular ideologies, but then cemented the Christian version of the story once he was established as sole ruler. So, because the majority of his soldiers were from France and Germany, so they weren't, you know, I mean, there were a heavy population of Christians within France, and were starting to be in Germany, but the majority of them were pagans. So, you know, he kind of kept himself, you know, loosely open to other gods to, you know, basically gain the backing and supporting of his troops.
I looked it up. I guess those medallions depicted Constantine and his children.
Okay. Yeah, in fact, I think Lactantius, the Christian writer I just mentioned, I think he actually tutored one of Constantine's sons. So, several years after his success at taking sole rulership, it was then that he said he had been following the Christian God the whole time. But during the events leading up to this, his sole rulership, he used vague enough symbols and vague enough language that it could be interpreted multiple ways, and probably was scratched up to good politics. So changing gears, immediately after Galerius' death, Maximinus Daia marched west in an attempt to grab all of Asia Minor before anybody else, such as Licinius, the other co-ruler in the east, could react. Licinius had become Valerius Severus's replacement, as we talked, in the east. So they both made an effort to take over the Eastern Empire, but ended up striking a peace deal and established borders. So they're back to kind of working with one another. Maxentius, on the other hand, wanted to force Maximinus Daia to recognize him as Augustus. He had this obsession with, you know, wanting to be recognized officially as Augustus. And so he set his focus on overtaking the Western Empire, which meant defeating Constantine. And so in 311, he declared war against Constantine. So Constantine reached out to Licinius to secure an alliance which would isolate Italy and ensure Constantine couldn't be surrounded as he dealt with Maxentius. Excuse me. Realizing the power shift with this alliance, Maximinus Daia sent an envoy to Rome, ensuring Maxentius political recognition and full legitimacy in return for a military alliance. So Maxentius agreed, since this was what he had wanted all along. And so the board was set. You have Constantine and Licinius against Maxentius and Maximinus Daia. So in 312, the battle to come, which would come to be known as one of the most important and influential battles in history, was at the time just another battle in civil war amongst fellow Romans. So Constantine's advisors tried to convince him to stay in Gaul, which would either force Maxentius to come to Constantine, where Constantine would have the upper hand in supplies and forces, or it would force Maxentius to remain in Rome, which would cause him to increase his taxes in order to support his new position as Augustus and help raise the necessary mobile army needed to defeat Constantine. So this more than likely, you know, if he did remain in Rome, this would more than likely push the citizens of Rome over the edge, because they were already, you know, being heavily taxed in order to support Maxentius's efforts in basically not really rebuilding Rome, but, you know, making Rome more majestic. So he had a lot of architectural projects in place, which one was the Basilica of Maxentius, which I don't know, Pastor, if you guys visited that when you were there. It would have been called the Basilica of Constantine, since he, as we'll get into
I
here,
don't
but-
remember being there.
Okay.
It doesn't look familiar either.
Okay, so this was the largest freestanding building that Rome had ever built. So that was one of Maxentius's primary projects. So he had already raised taxes, so the the opinion of Maxentius was already falling in the toilet. But in 312, Constantine, against the advisement of his advisors, he could have just waited it out, and Maxentius, either would have came to him or basically been overthrown. But 312, he decided to march on Rome with a quarter of his troops. So he marches on Rome with 40,000 troops, while Maxentius is waiting in Rome with his troops, which were over 100,000. So you have 40 against 100,000. So Constantine's soldiers, though, were all veterans. They were Germans. Don't mess with the Germans. And extremely loyal to him. Whereas Maxentius's men were mostly raw recruits whose loyalty was mediocre at best. Constantine demonstrated what kind of conqueror he wanted to be during his march through Italy. As he sacked each town, he ordered his men to not plunder the towns or kill the citizens. What time is it supposed to be done?
45.
45, okay. Maxentius sent a cavalry unit to intercept Constantine during his march, but his army was able to flank and surround the cavalry, sending them in retreat. Many towns that Constantine approached welcomed him with celebration. Constantine's military war was going good, but his political war was going even better. So Constantine remained in Milan for a time to rest and resupply, sending out an expedition to gather supplies and intelligence. And so Maxentius caught word of this expedition and sent a significant number of his Praetorian Guard to intercept the smaller expedition, but Maxentius's much larger force was somehow defeated by Constantine's expedition. So this is about the time that God started to enter into Constantine's story, because he started making a habit of winning against the worst odds. Similar battles occurred over the next several months. Constantine's smaller forces would be surrounded by overwhelming numbers from Maxentius's army, but Maxentius's army would be routed away in defeat. So eventually it got to the point where envoys of Maxentius's army would show up at Constantine's doorstep announcing their surrender. So Constantine still had one more obstacle to overcome, and that was Rome itself. So pulling a siege on Rome was next to impossible given its garrisons and wealth of supplies. So really all Maxentius would need to do is sit inside the city and wait for Constantine to give up. On top of that, Maxentius ordered all of the bridges in Rome to be demolished, which would not stop Constantine, but it would slow him down significantly. So Constantine was in no hurry, though, knowing that he was in full control of all of Italy and marched south at a slow pace. Every town Constantine passed on his way into Rome would cheer him on and wish him well as emperor. And within the walls of Rome, the citizens began emulating those citizens in the other cities, and Constantine gained more and more sympathizers within Rome. And Maxentius, instead of Constantine, started worrying that he instead would not be able to hold out against the siege given the turning attitude and support of his citizens. So Maxentius determined that he needed to be proactive before he lost Rome, and so in 312, with Constantine parked just beyond the ruined Milvian Bridge, just northwest of Rome, over the Tiber River, Maxentius consulted with his soothsayers to feel out what his gods wanted him to do. His soothsayers told Maxentius that the enemies of Rome would be defeated that very day, but they did not specify who those enemies were. And so he ordered his army out the gates to confront Constantine. On the other side, just the night before, is when Constantine supposedly made his own supernatural connection, and now believed completely that he was fighting with the blessing of the one true God. Obviously, he didn't say this until, years later, when he became Sole Emperor. So given that Maxentius had the bridges destroyed, he had to have his army build a series of pontoon bridges to cross the river. Maxentius outnumbered Constantine 2-1. So Maxentius extended his army line along the banks of the Tiber, and Constantine followed suit and extended his line so that they wouldn't be flanked. So that made his line basically twice as thin as Maxentius's. Constantine made the first move, ordering his cavalry to engage, and Maxentius answered in kind. In short order, Maxentius's less experienced cavalry was broken up, and so Constantine ordered his infantry to also engage. The fight was short, and Maxentius's army was pushed back, but because they were so close to the river, they had nowhere to go, causing disorder. Maxentius ordered retreat back into Rome, but that sparked panic, and too many men were trying to cross the temporary bridge they built. And so hundreds of soldiers drowned along with Maxentius as they tried to cross their makeshift bridge. So Maxentius was 34 years old when he drowned. The next day, Constantine entered Rome, a hero. It would have been tradition for him to march up to the temple of Jupiter to offer sacrifice, but he refused to do so. Instead, he headed to the palace to meet with the Senate to start building a relationship. He told them that all of the privileges that the Senate used to have to enjoy would be returned to them, further adding to his image of a merciful ruler and causing the Senate and the people of Rome to proclaim him the greatest Augustus and senior member of the Tetrarch. So Constantine ordered all mention of Maxentius to be damned and all inscriptions of his name to be scratched out. So this is how the Basilica of Maxentius became known as the Basilica of Constantine. So he took credit for, this glorious structure that Maxentius built. Constantine also ordered Maxentius's body to be dragged out of the Tiber and beheaded. The head was then paraded through the city and then sent to North Africa to show that Constantine was now in charge. Constantine then abolished completely the Praetorian Guard, putting an end to almost 400 years of a historical institution. The remaining guardsmen were reassigned all over the empire, and their main base was demolished. And that's where we'll stop.
Yeah, tell me about Constantine.
He did what? Three words.
Constantine. 3 words. From some.
And the Praetorian Guard was in the state that it was in because it wasn't just the veterans that were supposed to be in it anymore. They opened it up to everyone.
Yep. Yeah, they opened up the recruitment to the common folk. Which, wasn't actually a bad move because, the Praetorian Guard had become so corrupted, I guess, because they were, all about pay and they had too much control.
Right. But I mean, there's probably a reason